Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the Science Policy Business Forum, the UN Environment Programme's premier multi-sector convening platform. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm editor-at-large with Reuters, and I'm thrilled to be hosting this high-level opening plenary. This forum is a catalyst for nature-positive change that strives for a fairer, more equitable world. It builds on the power of partnership to scale up solutions, ones that are driven by advances in science and technology, empowering policies and innovative financing. And today we launch the very first of the forum's regional mechanisms here in Asia Pacific. The aim is to bring a regional, multi-sector perspective to the work of the international community on the environmental dimension of the SDGs and harness region-focused solutions and partnerships to contribute to the global context. This is the fourth time that I host for the Science Policy Business Forum, and I can safely say that there is a strong momentum building here. The strength of this forum lies in its ability to bring together partners and networks from business, industry, finance, science, government, and civil society. Our challenge, and I say this every time, our challenge, as always, must be for all of these communities to communicate effectively with one another, to tell their stories, to listen to each other, and to work on ways to collaborate efficiently and effectively. Today's Asia Pacific Forum, held under the theme Towards a Healthy Rebound for People, Nature and Economies, is convened in conjunction with the fourth session of the Forum of Ministers and Environment Authorities hosted by the Republic of Korea. To that end, and to begin, it is my great pleasure to introduce Her Excellency Yang Yong-ae, Minister of Environment, the Republic of Korea, who would like to welcome you all with this message.
내외 기빈 여러분 반갑습니다. 환경부 장관 한정혜입니다. 대한민국 수원에서 개최되는 제4차 아태 환경장관 포럼을 계기로 처음 개최되는 아태 과학정책 기업 포럼에 참여해 주신 것을 진심으로 환영합니다. 유네분 최근 발간한 Making Peace with Nature를 통해 기후위기가 생물 다양성의 손실, 환경오염과 연계돼 현재와 미래 세대를 위협하고 있음을 경고하고 있습니다. 하지만 오늘 포럼의 주제처럼 우리는 이 위기를 인간, 자연 그리고 경제의 더 나은 재건의 기회로 삼아야 합니다. 재생에너지와 친환경 미래차 등 녹색 산업과 투자의 기회, 혁신적 과학기술 발전의 기회, 그리고 탄소 중립을 뒷받침하는 정책 혁신의 기회로 말입니다. 대한민국도 이 기회를 놓치지 않고자 합니다. 지난해 7월 그린 뉴딜을 포함한 한국판 뉴딜 종합계획을 통해 코로나19와 기후위기로부터 보다 나은 재건의 발판을 마련했고, 올해 9월에는 탄소중립기본법을 제정해 세계에서 14번째로 2050년 탄소중립을 법제화한 국가가 됐습니다. 이 법률에서는 2050 탄소중립 실현을 위해 국가의 전략과 또 중기 온실가스 감축 목표를 설정하고 그 이행을 점검해 나가는 절차를 체계화했고, 정부와 기업 대표, 전문가와 미래 세대가 참여하는 거버넌스라고 할 수 있는 탄소중립위원회를 신설했습니다. 또한 기후대응 기금을 마련해 산업계의 온실가스 감축, 취약계층의 기후변화 적응, 공정한 전환의 마중물이 될 수 있도록 했습니다. 산업계는 글로벌 탄소중립의 시대를 먼저 피부로 느끼고 환경사회 지배구조를 바탕으로 경영 전략을 세우고 있습니다. 석탄산업 대신 아리백 등 에너지 전환에 앞장서고 수소산업, 해상풍력, 무공해차, 플라스틱의 완전 재활용, 순환경제 등 새로운 성장의 길을 열고 있습니다. 이러한 산업계의 혁신적 변화 움직임은 한국 민간 R&D 1천억 달러의 시대와 한국형 녹색분류 체계를 바탕으로 한 녹색금융을 통해 새로운 성장을 적극 뒷받침하게 될 것입니다. 내외 기빈 여러분, 현재의 팬데믹과 기후위기 시대에 미래의 발생 가능한 피해를 줄이고 새로운 경쟁력을 창출하기 위해 과학기술의 발전, 정책적 지원, 기업 혁신과 투자, 이 삼위일체가 아시아 태평양 전 지역에서 이루어지도록 우리는 더욱 협력하고 또 연대해야 합니다. 오늘 이 뜻깊은 자리에서 나누실 다양한 재현과 지혜를 토대로 해서 탄소 중립을 향한 여정에 그 누구도 소외되지 않도록 대한민국도 그간의 경험과 성과를 공유하며 우리 모두의 더 나은 재건을 위해 기여하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
All right, thank you to the Minister for her words. Today's high level opening session is made up of two segments. Let me just run you through those. The morning segment with a subheading From Pandemic to Recovery, which will run just over 2 hours. The afternoon segment, Technology, Innovation, People, will take us to the close of this session at around 2:30 local time. After that, we will move to the thematic sessions on marine litter and zoonosis. So an exciting, a busy day ahead. Let me kick it off straight away by introducing our first super panel this morning. To set the scene, Dechen Chering is UNEP Regional Director in Asia Pacific. On the imperative to act in a timely fashion, Sir Bob Watson, former chief of the International Panel on Ecosystems and Biodiversity, so well armed with the science and with the data. On the transformative actions required to build better, Lakshmi Dewanti, Vice President of UNEA and Director General of Climate Change, Ministry of the Environment and Forestry in Indonesia. Bambang Sustastono, Vice President of the Asian Development Bank. On the theme of leaving no one behind, His Excellency Stephen Victor, Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Environment at Palau. Dr. Pema Gemancho, former Minister of Agriculture and Forests, Bhutan, also Director General, International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. Kaveh Sahedi, Deputy Executive Secretary, UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, to help us understand how exponential technologies can assist in COVID-19 recovery and how to bridge the technology divide. Brenda Harvey will join us. Brenda is General Manager of IBM Asia Pacific. And finally, on the ambitious actions that pave the way, Dr. Li Zhang, Secretary General, the Society of Entrepreneurs for Ecology Foundation in China, whose group, by the way, represents the top 900 businesses in China, but who is also himself an accomplished biodiversity scientist. A very warm welcome to all of you. What a fabulous panel to get together for this very first part of the session. Let me start with you, Dechen. You lead UNEP's work in 41 countries across the region. First, I want to congratulate you and the Secretariat for convening the first of the forum's regional sessions. It really is a pleasure to see this community grow. As I said, I've been involved with a number of these. Tell us, Dechen, first more about the theme towards a healthy rebound for people, nature, and economies, and why technology, partnerships, and integrated solutions for nature are so critical to a healthy recovery from the pandemic across the region.
Thank you, Axel. And Excellencies, colleagues, friends, I'm really pleased to welcome you to the inaugural Asia Pacific Science Policy Business Forum. Let me start by thanking the government of the Republic of Korea for supporting the convening of this important event. And I really would like to thank all our partners for making this event and this forum possible. When we look back at the past 20 months, we clearly see how human society is interconnected and all barriers are in fact artificial. The natural world does not recognize barriers, neither do pandemics that threaten human life and health. The COVID-19 global pandemic has taken a drastic human toll, and the economic and social impacts of the pandemic are reverberating globally, leading governments to mount the fastest, largest crisis response to help strengthen pandemic response, healthcare systems, and economies. We must not forget, however, that the COVID-19 responses must also jumpstart a nature-friendly recovery without which humanity will not be able to fight, let alone prevent future pandemics. As humans diminish biodiversity by cutting down forests and building more infrastructure, We are exacerbating the impacts of climate change and increasing the risk of pandemics such as COVID-19. The latest Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change report is a code red for humanity. Our world continues to heat at an accelerating rate. Statistics show that our region bears the brunt of a significant portion of climate induced natural disasters, which have affected more than 1.6 billion people since the year 2000. We contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, while the least developed countries and small island developing states in our region pay a disproportionate price that puts their very existence at risk. The systemic issues that helped to create this pandemic are the same ones driving the three planetary crises: the climate crises, the biodiversity and nature crises, and the pollution and waste crises. COVID-19 recovery strategies in many countries in Asia and the Pacific need to fully incorporate green development principles and experiences and to integrate adequately green finance for delivering the environment dimension of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The experience of UNEP in environmental multilateralism over the past 50 years confirms that global responses need to be coordinated. Science policy interface needs to be enhanced and embedded in responses and actions. Actions must be local and taken by all countries and sectors, including by the industry and finance sector. The Science Policy Business Forum Asia Pacific brings together influential partners from multiple sectors at an opportune moment to examine pathways for a sustainable, equitable, and inclusive rebound from COVID-19 that is good for the people, the planet, and economies. We look forward to excellent discussions which will feed into the ministerial process. Today's event is the start of meaningful cooperation between diverse sectors unified by a common goal and an aspiration for a better life for all. I thank you all. Thank you, Axel.
Thank you very much indeed for those words, Dechen, and for setting the scene. And to build on that, I want to turn now to Sir Bob Watson. Sir Bob is the lead author of the UN flagship report, Making Peace with Nature. And we're going to get into the global and regional imperative for nature positive action as countries start to rebound and design their recovery plans post-COVID. And I guess, Sir Bob, this can't happen quickly enough, right?
First, let me say it's a pleasure to be here today. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution are three interconnected issues that threaten achieving any of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and hence threaten human well-being for current and future generations. Each of these environmental issues is also an economic, development, security, social, moral, and ethical issue, and adversely affects all people, rich and poor, but mostly the poorest people in the poorest countries. The Earth's climate is warming at an unprecedented rate due to an increasing atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, caused by the combustion of fossil fuels and land use practices. The Earth has already warmed by about 1.2 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution and is accompanied by changes in precipitation, an increase in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events, an increase in sea level, and melting of mountain glaciers, permafrost, and sea ice. Biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystems and their services is also occurring at an unprecedented rate due to a combination of threats: land and sea use change, exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. 1 million out of a total 8 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction. Populations are in decline and species habitats are being lost. For example, ecosystems at 1.5 degrees Celsius, 70 to 90% of warm water corals will be in decline. At a 2 degrees Celsius warming, over 99% would be in decline. These changes in climate and biodiversity are already adversely affecting food and water security, human health, livelihoods, and displacing millions of people at a significant economic cost. The world is not on course to achieve any of the environmental goals. While some progress has been made to conserve and restore biodiversity, none of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets were fully met. And with the current pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the world is not on a pathway to meet the Paris target of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius, but on a pathway to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. While climate change has not been the dominant driver of diversity loss to date, if the Paris targets are not met, climate change will likely become the dominant driver in the coming decades. Hence, it is critical that the issues of climate change and loss of biodiversity are tackled together. The upcoming COP26 for climate change and COP15 for biodiversity must acknowledge these interconnections and develop harmonized targets and actions. The need to transition to a low carbon economy and conserve biodiversity is needed. This will require transforming our relationship with nature, transforming our economic, financial, and productive systems, and reassessing our norms and value systems. We need to complement the use of GDP as a measure of economic activity by using inclusive wealth in decision making. That is to say, the combination of built human and natural capital, which is a much better measure of sustainable economic growth. We need to eliminate perverse fossil fuel, transportation, energy, mining, and agricultural subsidies, and use the money saved for funding sustainable energy and agricultural practices. We need to address indirect subsidies by internalizing externalities, and we need to embrace the concept of a circular economy. We need to manage our productive sectors holistically. That is to say, the energy, agriculture, and water sectors each influence each other and depend on each other. We need to promote a healthy diet, reduce food and water waste, and adopt a One Health approach that seeks to simultaneously secure optimal outcomes for human health, animal health, and health of the environment. The Asia-Pacific region is a key region for many reasons. It includes several countries with strong economic growth. It includes 8 of the most populous countries in the world. It includes 6 of the top 15 carbon dioxide emitters and includes 7 of the 17 mega-diverse countries in the world. Therefore, the Asia-Pacific region has a significant influence on the demand for energy and natural resources and impacts on climate change and biodiversity. While industrialized countries who are responsible for most of the environmental damage today must take the lead, but without concerted action by countries in the Asia-Pacific region, the world cannot successfully address any of these issues. While the principle of differentiated responsibility is well accepted, it is also well recognized that most developing countries will require financial and technical assistance from developed countries and through the private sector. These issues are not just for governments. We need all branches of national and subnational governments to work with intergovernmental organizations, financial organizations, private sector, NGOs, civil society, indigenous people, scientific and educational organizations, and the media. We need polycentric governance structures where all voices are heard, but the power of the vested interests who want to maintain the status quo must be eliminated. The time for action is now. The decade of the 2020s is critical. We need to reduce our global emissions of greenhouse gases by at least 45% relative to 1990 by 2030 as a first step to net zero emissions by mid-century, and we need to conserve and restore biodiversity if we want to attain any of the SDGs. If we fail to act, our children and grandchildren will never forgive us, given cost-effective and socially acceptable solutions are available. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Bob. And we will hear in a second from one of the regional governments. But I was going to save this for later, Sir Bob. But let me put it to you very quickly now. When you pen a report with the title "Making Peace with Nature," of course, it begs the question: do you think we really ultimately can make that peace?
We have the technologies, we have the policies. If government can work with the private sector and civil society, it is possible, but it will take political will and it will take trust among governments and with the private sector.
Very good. Sir Bob, thanks a lot. Well, look, let's hear about some of that political will. I'm delighted to introduce Her Excellency Ms. Lakshmi Detwanti from Indonesia. Your Excellency, many thanks for joining us. As the Indonesian government rolls out its recovery plan, how different will environmental management post-pandemic be from environmental management pre-COVID? Hello, Minister. Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me? Okay, I think we're having we're having some technical issues. Oh yes, I can hear you now.
Hello?
Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. Did
Can
you
you
hear
hear
my
me now?
question, Minister? Yes, I can. Did you hear my question?
Can you repeat your question because I hardly
Yes, of
to
course.
hear you?
My question was, as the government in Indonesia rolls out its recovery plan, I wondered how different environmental management will look post-pandemic from pre-pandemic times.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Uh, First of all, on behalf of Ministry of Environment and Forestry of Indonesia, it is my pleasure to share some Indonesia views in this regard of course, under the themes of these sessions toward a healthy rebound for people and natural economies. So, Excellencies, of course, it is a great honor for me to speak at this very important forum. So I would like to at this stage, I also would like to recognize the great effort of the committee who worked very hard to prepare. Um, sorry. To to prepare this forum, particularly in conceptualizing its substance. So I see that the theme is very timely manner amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and this forum is very important as we face the global challenges to mobilize effort to survive and build back better. Let me share the role of forest and environment that are very significant to support efforts, especially in Indonesia. The new normal conditions has also provided us opportunities to be more productive. So we acknowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic has no doubt has a wide and multi-dimensional impact. Accordingly, the government of Indonesia, through the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, is continuously contributing to the economic recovery of the community while also improving our ecosystems through the national economic recovery programs that covers three main lines of activities. Namely, the first is the development of food estate. Second is labor-intensive social forestry, as well as labor-intensive mangrove and peatland rehabilitations. The food estate development agenda is based on the considerations that the food area is starting to decrease. In addition, food security has also now become part of national security. The long-term program is in the form of measures to provide new land, rehabilitate existing land by increasing facilities to support land productivity, especially in terms of irrigation and drainage in swampy land. This food area cover approximately 600,000 hectares. The government of Indonesia is of the view that strengthening the food production side is essential to ensure that people have easier access to reach their basic needs during the difficult time. When access is open, food security is strengthened. For this purpose, Ministry of Environment and Forestry has allocated 12.7 million hectares of forest area for community access in the form of social forestry programs. In addition to that numbers, the ministry has also reserved 4.4 million hectares for the agrarian reform programs. So the broad framework of social forestry is to provide the widest possible access to the community, the use of forest land for economic improvement without changing the functions of the forest area itself. Uh, with regard to the second activities, labor intensive mangrove and peatland rehabilitations, in 2020, our program have covered the country's all 34 provinces, involved more than 53,000 people, and succeeded in planting of more than 17,000 hectares of mangrove. Received income from this program are used by the community for their children's education needs, capital to open a small business, and meet the basic needs of the household. Overall, the target set for this program, also including restorations or hydrological function of more than 36,000 hectares of peatland, as well as establishment of 28 smallholders industrial productions forest management unit. And along with this agenda, we have a so-called agenda of forestry and other land use net sink by 2030 for Indonesia. It is our commitment to economic recovery for the entire communities and to maintain the balance of nature, especially maintaining the country's biodiversity and forest cover, and will be back-to-back working and strongly implemented. So, Excellencies, Indonesia do have a hope and views that the United Nations Environmental Assembly or UNEA has to send a strong message to the world that inclusive global actions in this action to effort to back and to contribute the achievement of the 2030 agenda of sustainable development and various global targets. So let me conclude by emphasizing that exploring the agenda to improve community welfare in the post-pandemic era is inseparable from improving environmental quality. We are aware that it requires a long process and there is no shortcut. Active participation, strong coordinations among institutions, as well as uniformity of parameters in evaluating the sustainable development are also necessary. So, hence, I believe through strong and robust collaborations, through existing multilateral fora and other fora, we can all achieve a resilient and inclusive post-pandemic world. So I thank you, and I do hope that we're gonna to have a very fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Your Excellency. And I will come back later to the private sector piece, and specifically private sector investment and the sorts of policies you're putting in place to nurture that sort of investment. Many thanks, Lakshmi, to you. We move now to Bambang Susantono, Vice President of the ADB, the Asia Development Bank. Bambang, the economies of Asia and the Pacific region are starting to bounce back. It's pretty sporadic, but it's inconsistent given the varying degrees with which countries in the region have been hit by the pandemic, and indeed the way they react to natural disasters caused primarily by climate change. In that context, how will the ADB scale up nature positive investment?
Thank you, Axel. And first of all, congratulations to the organizers, and also glad to be here. Axel, you pose a very important questions because you put the word inconsistent. So we remember that before the pandemic, Asia has been off track to SDGs. Yeah, we have a progress. Progress is not enough to achieve the target in 2030. And because of the pandemic, our study that 80 million people falls back into extreme poverty. So our homework to catch up SDG is now bigger than ever. On the other hand, we also witness digitalization, which become new normal of our daily life. And climate change problem, which becomes more severe, as has been stated by previous speaker. So to tackle these challenges, business as usual is not an option. And I believe countries must implement a green, inclusive, resilient recovery pattern of the development. Has at least, according to me, we have 5 pillars. First pillar is inclusiveness. We must pay attention to those who are poor, vulnerable, underserved, don't have access to finance, digital connectivity, and so on and so forth. So this is on the bottom of the society, on the bottom of the pyramid of the society. We don't want to see the widening gap create a social political problems in the society. And I just want to share with you in the tripartite report, UNDP, UNESCAP, and ADB, that launched early this year, we identified the possibility of Asia having what we call the K-shaped recovery, like an alphabet K. So instead of V or a U, where some countries, sector, or communities can, bounce back after the crisis, this is something that is slamming a widening gap between those who are taking off, which, if you see the K alphabet, one is going uptrend, and the other one is downward trajectory. So in short, the widening inequalities is something that it is likely to be a witness after the recovery process. So that is one. Inclusiveness is must. Second pillar, in this kind of process, is green. I think I don't want to repeat other speakers that already mentioned this. One that not only maintains environmental and climate goals, but also suited to a low carbon world. Some of you may be skeptical that a green, inclusive, and sustainable recovery requires economic compromise or entails high additional costs. But to me, it is rather about spending better, not necessarily more. Sometimes we have to be smart in trying to decide what kind of approach that we are going to have in the development process. I believe this is why we are seeing worldwide more and more success stories in applying, for example, in a circular economy or nature-based solutions, where we can, combine in a better sort of like situation, the green and the gray infrastructure, for example. The third pillar is human capital development, and this is to prepare the society for more digital and green development. Providing basic needs is still very important task, but now we have to do more, for example, on digital literacy, digital finance literacy, and how our young people involved more in the campaign that anything right now that we are doing has to be embedded nature as part of the approach itself. Fourth is attracting greater private sector capitals. I don't know whether you are going to go deep into on this, Axel, but I think this is very important because public sector budget is very limited. And in this case, the government must create a business-friendly environment and a conducive ecosystem for innovations to grow. Sometimes I personally think that PPP, public-private partnership, is not enough It can be expanded to P4, public, private, and people partnership, in which right now, because of the digital technology, people can participate directly in development process using digital platform and financing modalities such as crowdfunding, for example. So those are the pillars, and I hope that I am answering your questions. Back to you, Axel.
Thank you very much, Bambang. And I do want to follow up on the private sector piece that you just mentioned, and how best to leverage that. You talk of nurturing a business friendly environment. I wonder what the ADB, how the ADB feels the balance between policy and business should be. There are those who say the policy leadership need to wield a longer stick, need to be a little bit more aggressive in the way they try and engage the private sector, need to be a little bit stricter in their engagement of the private sector. And there are those who say we need to do this with carrots. What is your feeling overall?
I think let me first give you some numbers here, because Asia needs about $1.7 trillion per year until 2030 to develop infrastructure. This is about 5% of regional GDP. The number is huge, and if we calculate all the public sector alone, it's about 1/3 in maximum. So that we need, of course, there is no doubt that we need private sector. And to do so, there is always contradictions between private and public, but I see that they can be sort of like goes hand in hand, because the way that we do, for example, in ADB is trying, number one, to create an environment that's conducive for the business itself by assisting government, for example, to do some regulatory reform, to use their limited budget for leveragings, and also goes to the sectors that are non commercially viable, for example, that cannot be done by private sector, but leave the other one that profitable, or perhaps can be structured in a way that the private sector can jump in and also participate in even in the social sector, like educations or health or others, right? And one more new things that right now is coming more and more common in our development finance approach is what we call the blended financing. We blend all the possible resources, either from philanthropies, from a multilateral development bank like us, or from the private sector, in a way that trying to get the something that big in a more affordable kind of way, so that it will putting all the dimensions of environment, nature-based solution, for example, or perhaps another accounting to the nature that has to be embedded into the development process. And if we only take into account that one itself, it seems that it is a higher cost, Axel. But for me, that higher cost is reflected in the long term and sustainability of the development itself. So by blending these resources, we can have a more sort of like good approach, which is green, inclusive, and also sustainable in the future.
Okay. Bambang, thank you very much indeed for your insights there. Many thanks. Appreciate it. Right. Palau is an archipelago of 586 islands in the Western Pacific Ocean. It is warming, and it is getting warmer every year. Clearly, climate change poses existential threats to the country as much as it does to other small island developing states. This, of course, has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Stephen Victor is the Minister of Environment at Palau, and I'm delighted to say joins us now. Minister, I hope you can hear me okay. How are you coping generally? First, let's start with that.
Thank you, Axel, and Excellencies, guest officials, ladies and gentlemen. As we speak now, there's a storm brewing to the east of us. This is quite normal for this time of the year for Palau. And so in recent years, we have seen an increased incidence of storms affecting us. And so we are trying to cope. Anyway, I'm honored to join such an esteemed and diverse panel to discuss pathways towards recovering better together, and I emphasize to not leaving anyone behind from the challenges of climate change. These challenges have been further exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic. Globally, and most deeply true for Asia's coastal communities and Pacific small island developing states, climate change has negatively impacted livelihoods, landscapes, seascapes, and economies with long-term impacts on cultures which are reliant on the ocean and the natural environment. Say, Axel, it is posing existential threat to us as people, to our cultures, and to our islands. Nationally, sea level has caused displacement, infrastructure, territorial, natural history, and cultural preservation losses, to name a few. Saltwater intrusion and low-lying taro patches, which have been around for generations, have been abandoned. These have negatively impacted women farmers and the supply of taro, a favorite local food staple.
I
Ocean warming
wonder.
and ocean acidification.
My apologies for interrupting, Minister. I wonder to what extent the most vulnerable could be left behind, the degree with which you fear for that, and what needs to be done, what you are doing to avoid a scenario like that.
So there isn't much that many of us can do locally, as we all understand that to reach 1.5 degrees reduction in global emissions uh, does not hinge on many of us in small Pacific island. It hinges on actions taken by the G20 countries, and some of them are within our Asian region. And so, while as small island nations, we fear for our existential threat uh, and trying to do what we can to improve our resilience, there is only so much that we can do locally. Uh, Going into Glasgow for the COP26, it is imperative that we continue to work with big nations uh, and continue to build that strong partnership for them to uh, take drastic actions that can help to safeguard our future, not only
Yes.
as humanity, but ensure that we are all taking actions together. So while we understand that these are hard for many of us, particularly following the pandemic, actions must be taken now. I think we can no longer wait for actions to be taken. And I believe that it can be done because as a global community, we have come together to address COVID-19 pandemic,
Yes. Yes.
a disease that impact humans, and we've been able to put it somewhat under control in less than 2 years. Imagine the global response that could be taken to reach 1.5 within the next few years.
Right.
So
Right.
it is a matter of just taking actions now, not
Are
later.
you?
It has to be
Very
now.
quickly, I know we have a little bit of a delay here, so apologies again for interrupting. But very quickly, you mentioned COP26 in Glasgow. Clearly, this is being billed by many as a make or break, whether one agrees with the way it's being billed or not. How optimistic are you that we'll see concrete action come from this meeting?
So I am one of the Pacific champion for climate change. There are 5 other high-level official from across the Pacific who will be going to Glasgow for this COP26. So I'm optimistic about COP26, noting that the global restriction on travel may not see the level of participation that has in the past, and maybe that is good for carbon reduction. Not many people will be traveling, so that may be in itself a good thing. But I do hope that many leaders across the globe can participate virtually and ensuring that they can be part of this conversation toward defining specific actions that they can get to act on in the next few years. One of the main key messages that I will be promoting is ensuring that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is resolved. So that's one of the key things that I myself and the Palau delegation, along with members of the visits, will be at COP26.
Okay. Very good. Minister Stephen Victor, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And do stay with us, and hopefully we'll get your views later on private sector investment as well. Just before I go to our next speaker, I just wanted to inform all of our viewers that you can send in your own questions for all of our speakers. You can share those questions in the Q&A tab on the platform. Do send your questions through, and I will endeavor to get to as many of those as I can. We stay with this theme of leaving no one behind. Dr. Pima Gyamtsho is former Minister of Agriculture and Forests in Bhutan, Director General, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. And Dr. Gyamtsho, you were born and brought up in a remote village in Bhutan. You've had a colorful career as a world-class scholar, a government minister, and a farmer. You clearly have an affinity for the Hindu Kush region, but it is a region that is vulnerable. Unprecedented challenges caused by compounded climate and pandemic shocks. What are the most pertinent threats, Dr. Gyamtsho, and what is the coping strategy at the moment for overcoming those threats?
Thank you very much, Alex. You're right. I don't know about world-class scholar, but I'm definitely a farmer and somebody who grew up in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region in the mountains. And so the ice and snow disappear from our mountains. And as you all know, we are now living through this pandemic. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking on behalf of the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMO, based in Kathmandu, Nepal, and representing the voices of the millions of people living in and around the Hindu Kush Himalayan mountains and valleys. ICIMO is an intergovernmental organization that brings together eight countries of the Hindu Kush Himalaya to work together to solve the complex challenges around land and water in what is one of the poorest and most fragile regions in the world. Also hard hit by the global forces such as climate change and globalization, and of course, more recently, COVID-19. And yet, the Hindu Kush Himalaya is what we call the pulse of the planet and is the water towers of Asia. It contains the headwaters of 10 major Asian river systems and holds the largest snow and ice deposits outside of the two poles. You may have even heard of it being referred to as the third pole. And ironically, despite having such rich water resources, many people in the HKH either face acute water scarcity or increased risk of floods, and these risks are multiplying fast. The COVID-19 pandemic has hit the region hard, and the mountain communities even harder. Tourism industry, for example, which provides the major source of income and employment, was brought to a standstill, affecting the whole hospitality chain. In the mountains, this includes the guides, the porters, and the small lodge and camp operators. Migrant workers have returned from overseas, needing extra pressure on the limited resources, including for food, water, and energy. The elderly, women, and children were most severely affected with little access to health and education facilities. In many cases, communities suffered the compounded effects of both the pandemic and the climate change. That is, sicknesses and the sufferings, shortages of food and other essentials, lockdowns and restrictions from COVID, followed by natural disasters like flash floods and landslides, cutting off communication and basic supplies from lower areas. All this have reinforced the fact that what we had and what we considered normal before the pandemic was anything but normal. It was simply not sustainable and was self-defeating. Therefore, as we plan ahead, we must find ways to do things differently. We must change our consumption patterns, our way of life, and even perhaps introducing a carbon marker on the goods and services that we use. At the same time, we must acknowledge that not all the ills can be blamed on climate change. For example, most of the landslides and even flash floods that occurred during this season were caused by ill planned and ill constructed infrastructure such as roads. To build that better, we need to start working on longer term nature friendly solutions that must not be a repeat of the pre pandemic standards. For example, tourism is one sector that I believe will bounce back and make a V shaped recovery. Are we prepared to make some compromises and embark on a more sustainable tourism industry, or will we capitalize on the immediate gains that are likely to be presented? To build back better, we must address the needs of the most vulnerable and include everyone. Throughout the pandemic, we have seen that women are disproportionately burdened with household work and taking care of children and elderly, besides suffering from domestic violence. Likewise, women and children are much more vulnerable to climate change impacts, such as floods and inclement weather patterns. Are we prepared to include targeted policy and institutional mechanisms to provide better protection and support for women and children? For mountain areas, the cost of building back better will be much higher than in other areas. Are governments prepared to adopt more environmental and nature-friendly development policies and plans? And are development partners willing to invest more and share their expertise? At Easy Mode, we are taking all this into consideration in the design and implementation of our programs. This includes working for a cleaner air. Air quality matters, and it is a transboundary issue. We are working towards securing water resources by monitoring glaciers and glacier lakes and connecting upstream and downstream areas. We are instituting community-based flood early warning systems and supporting our member countries in drought forecasting and various other climate advisory services. We are connecting parks and protected areas to enhance coordinated biodiversity and ecosystem protected areas, ecosystem protection across borders. We are introducing and promoting climate smart agriculture, tourism, and mountain enterprises to generate employment and income. We are also facilitating regional cooperation through organizing science policy dialogues and exchange of information, data, and good practices. These are few examples of the kinds of work we do on the ground. But the importance of upscaling this and other efforts cannot be underestimated. Towards this end, we are going to COP26 in Glasgow on climate change and COP15 in Kunming on biodiversity with the message that the HKH region requires urgent actions. Through increased financial investment and increased cooperation at all levels to rebound to a safer, more prosperous, and happier future for the billions of people depending on the resources from the HKH. I hope that this UNEP Science Policy Business Forum will help us in amplifying this message across the Asia, Pacific, and beyond, and that you will join us in our campaign to save the Hindu Kush Himalaya. We are counting on you, our key partner, UNEP, in the campaign, in this campaign, to join hands with us. Thank you. And back to you, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guillemcho. A fascinating insight into your region. Right, staying with the theme of leaving no one behind, Kaveh Sahedi is Deputy Executive Secretary for Sustainable Development, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Kaveh, thank you very much indeed for joining us. As countries move towards a net zero future, how do we look at the way they will finance this transition? How will they finance the transition, especially in the wake of the pandemic? This must be one of the most critical questions we have to ask ourselves.
Thank you very much, Axel, and greetings to excellencies, dear colleagues and friends. Axel, I mean, it's a key question, and in a way, we've got to take one step back and see what it is that we have to finance. My good friend, Vice President Bang Susantana from ADB, said that even before the pandemic, we were not on track as a region to achieve the SDGs. So there's almost like a shortage of investment already in the pathway that the countries had chosen to take. Now we've had the pandemic, and it's just simply exposed the chronic development challenges of our region, the inequality, the vulnerability, the environmental degradation. What it's done is it's pushed, something like 89 or 90 million people back into extreme poverty, and has led to at least 140 million jobs being lost. So that in a way that the need has almost expanded exponentially, and especially if you don't want to leave people behind, which is what you mentioned. In our region, the informal sector has been hit particularly hard, and that puts the livelihood of something like 1.3 billion people, workers, at risk. Not to mention small and medium enterprises that are the backbone of much of the region's economy. But I think a healthy rebound for people, a healthy rebound for nature, it is possible, and it's possible only by investing in the right way, investing in resilience, investing in inclusivity, investing in sustainability. So what would that take, is your question? Well, to start with, we need investments in risk reduction, right? In risk reduction systems that are actually designed for a very different future. They're designed for overlaying hazards of disease, of disaster, and of climate change. And our calculation is that to have such risk systems in place would take about $270 billion a year, or something that is the equivalent of around 0.85% of regional GDP. But this is only about a third of the current annual losses. So in a way, being prepared is not only the most effective, but also the most cost-effective way to handle the expanding and overlaying risks that lie ahead. But that's not the only investment that's needed, because response systems alone are simply not enough. For most people, a well-resourced social protection system has been and will continue to be the first line of defense in a crisis. So investing in comprehensive, universally available social protection systems is absolutely indispensable. And at the same time, we know that in our region, less than 5% of GDP is spent on social protection. And this is less than half of the global average and way below the OECD average. And this long-term underinvestment in people means that half of our population are still left to essentially fend for themselves when faced with a disaster, when faced with a pandemic, or indeed any kind of shock. And of course, we need to invest to increase not just resilience and preserve our development gains, but to address the triple planetary crisis that many of the previous speakers have talked about. And we've crunched our numbers, Axel. We know that investing in inclusivity, in resilience and sustainability, a sort of a package that we call Build Forward Better package that consists of policy actions like investing in universal access to healthcare, in social protection, in closing the digital divide, and of course, in strengthening climate and energy actions, it would cost somewhere in the region of $1.26 trillion a year. It sounds massive, but actually it boils down to less than $1 per person per day. So really that's the kind of level of investment that is lagging. But of course the means are shooting up all around the place. We see leaving no one behind, building forward better, has driven countries towards scaling up their own green fiscal instruments, unleashing in a way the power of finance, particularly innovative finance. And there are many, many examples from the green climate sustainability bonds that we've seen coming out in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and elsewhere, the debt for climate swaps and like the debt for climate swap facility that has emerged in the Pacific that can not only help open up in a way the fiscal space, the means for governments to spend, but also alleviate some of the mounting debt that comes from this crisis, especially in our Pacific SIDS and LBCs. And it means, I guess, a very different approach to our public finance as well, including what we've heard repeatedly, ending fossil fuel subsidies and introducing a carbon tax, like we're seeing emerge in Japan and Singapore, and emissions trading systems like we see in China, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, and elsewhere. So it's a big task, it's a big investment, it's got huge returns, and we're seeing a movement in the right direction, Axel.
Kaveh, just a quick question before I move on, and then we'll bring you back in the discussion later. How supported does the region feel by the international community, by developed nations, and how important a piece of the whole context is that?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. That's a question that we need to pose to countries like Indonesia, right? We are going on and on about the need to phase out coal for all of our coal-dependent countries in the region, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, others. And yet we know that many of them depend on that very coal, right, in terms of their economy. Without it, they lose large percentage, billions of dollars worth of their exports. They lose huge parts of their domestic tax resources, and of course the jobs. I haven't seen a lot of massive investment in a just transition, say in the coal industry, although we're beginning to see little movement. We have seen in the past solidarity in terms of reduced emissions from deforestation, investments in countries like Indonesia to reduce the rates of deforestation and compensate them for that. But still, the $100 billion for climate change is still missing. Foreign direct investment in our region is going down. So there probably is a bit of a gap. And that's going to be a big one for COP26, isn't it? To make sure that the trust is rebuilt in that financing piece.
Kaveh, thank you very much indeed. Kaveh Sahiri from ESCAP. Right, let's move on to technology. That critical piece of this whole discussion. Our lives, of course, during the pandemic made it extremely clear that our relationship with technology and our reliance on it is growing exponentially. Brenda Harvey is General Manager at IBM Asia Pacific and joins us now. Hi there, Brenda. How can exponential technologies help us improve our relationship with nature? What are the key barriers to this, and how are you at IBM overcoming them?
Sure. Well, Axel, first, let me start by acknowledging, as we've heard from all the other speakers, technology alone will not solve our challenges in climate change or COVID, but there is no doubt that government policies, actions, outcomes are absolutely being accelerated with science and exponential technologies, in addition to human innovation. We are curating exploding amounts of data that even got more immense through COVID as digital connections increased for many. In fact, in Asia, on average, consumer increased by 18 times their digital connections. So it didn't really contribute a lot to help in some cases, but it did break down the barriers to digital adoption. We really are focused on getting this data, leveraging IoT, devices at the edge, to change lives and nature, leaving no one behind, as we've been talking about, no country, no island, and using this data to address threats, vulnerabilities, and to be better prepared. And let me give you a few examples across Asia. And I'll start on following up even on some of the comments that Dr. Gimshera Bhutan mentioned about farming and water. So the first example is big data, AI, and what I call AI, artificial intelligence, but also augmented intelligence for smarter farms in India, for example, for corn, or in Thailand for sugarcane agriculture. This really is the foundation of many economies here in Asia, and factors as climate change, food security now with cyber threats have led to the industry using technology to drive more innovative approaches to protect and improve crop yields, for example. So together with a weather company and IBM Research, we've built these platforms of agribusiness tools and AI-powered solutions that bring the power of data and AI to make more informed, better decisions about crops. We use satellite data, multi-layer geospatial data, use machine learning to continue to learn from what the data is showing with advanced analytics, and to be able to run real-time queries and analysis for predictions and advisory, which is the most important part. Because what are you going to do to improve yield, history, and forecast, or manage disease and pest indicators that might be coming up? Look at high-definition crop monitoring or high-definition soil moisture. And so these are really relevant to ensuring the livelihood of farming, but also the global supply chain. We also see value in water, in analytics, to how you manage water distribution systems. We've worked in Bangalore, growing economy, and how do we ensure that the water system is there to support the population growth, and the entire life cycle of water pipeline infrastructure in China, working with Reifang as a key partner there. So data and AI, one. I think a second example is the use of blockchain technology. And this is an example in the Philippines, a plastic bank, where this also talks about inclusiveness, where all the members are members of the Philippines, can be. They created this recycling ecosystem where you receive these token credits for the plastic that you collect. And you can use that for family necessities, whether that's groceries, cooking, fuel, insurance, or school tuition. These asset-based tokens and the IBM blockchain platform provide trust and transparency. And it really enables millions of new members to be part of this incentivized recycling opportunity. However, it is inclusive if they have a phone and they have connectivity. So again, we need to have that government, private, public partnership working here to ensure that there is connectivity for everyone. Again, no one left behind. And then I think the last area is quantum computing. We have here in Singapore, academia, enterprise working together, materials, molecular science research, drug discovery for COVID or other pandemic challenges in biology, advanced materials to reduce global carbon footprint, increase battery life, and just really fight problems that previously were not possible to calculate on traditional compute. So those are some of the great examples. And then the barriers, I say the barriers with anything are cost and culture. And Kaveh talked about financing. So when we see the investment that's been made, huge investments across all countries and governments. And as I said, post-COVID, digital barriers to adoption have just essentially been removed. So the opportunity is now. But we do have to make sure that all our processes and leveraging technology do support ESG goals. SDG goals, every company needs to have them. They need to be clear. Pilots and prototypes need to scale, and those need to be funded. Again, going back to the challenge of cost. And we almost, really see this increase of need for academic communities, the barriers, skills, and talent. And how do we work together in countries with university, with public private, to bring together, to leverage technical skills with a common purpose for the future. And so access to connectivity is another one, and addressing security concerns.
I mean, just a quick follow-up on that, Brenda. I mean, we talk about equitable, fair deployment of technology. Clearly, it's a priority for IBM, as you've discussed, and indeed for other companies in the sector. But it does require really solid, efficient, effective partnership with policy. How successful do you think is IBM being across the region in making this equitable and making this fair?
I think we're seeing great progress. It's on everyone's agenda, and we actually are now capturing best practices, examples, and there are a number of things we're doing as we're developing these solutions, is making sure that no one is left behind in that solution. So I know we're talking about marine plastic litter. It's a huge issue, but most of it is in countries, right, where it's being greatest hit is where maybe the financing and the technology advancement is smallest. So we are working with those governments to pilot, to build, to invest. We talk about digital farming. Most of these are small farmers in India, developing countries. It needs help from the government initially, research and technology coming together. And we are seeing great opportunities across the grids, smart cities. We talk about weather, protecting and understanding advanced warning systems, and just in general overall, helping companies reduce their carbon footprint, and the government giving them incentives to do so.
Okay, Brenda, thank you so much. Brenda Harvey from IBM Asia Pacific. Dr. Li Jiang is Secretary General of the Society of Entrepreneurs for Ecology Foundation in China and joins us now. Dr. Jiang, COP26, we are reminded every day at the moment, rightly so, is just around the corner. A lot is at stake here. How can government, how can the private sector ensure that we maintain the ecosystems that really underpin our life on this planet?
As we know that the COP15 of the CBD Convention on Biodiversity Conservation will be held in Kunming in 1 week. And I just returned from the COP15's NGO Parallel Forum last weekend. So during the meeting, I believe Chinese government, together with the other parties of CBD, will announce a Kunming declaration. As we know that the version for biodiversity 2050 is living in harmony with nature. But we all know that the progress has been made in the last decade, and the 2011-2020 strategy plan for biodiversity, but we're deeply concerned that such progress has been insufficient to achieve Archie biodiversity targets. And we all know that a combination of measures are needed to help and reverse the loss of biodiversity, including actions to address land and sea use change. And the efforts and the commitment of many countries to protect 30% of their land and sea areas through a well-connected system of protected area and other effective area based on conservation measures by 2030. We expect the Kunming CBD will achieve a new target, or made a new target for us, for globally, to make our next 10 years biodiversity targets achievable. And certainly we know that all of this measurement should be a combination, not only one country or not only government country, but also we need efforts from all the civil society, from all the business, private sectors. We should work together. As we know that the COP26 of the UNFCCC will be will be held in this November. SEE together with Campaign for Nature, with Foundation, we published a report, a linkage report between the biodiversity and the climate crisis. So we cannot separate these challenges separately. So we need to consider how to address these challenges together. So as a civil society, SE Foundation, together with other NGO partners, we made our commitment to invest about 100 million US dollar in next 10 years to preserve the biodiversity in China. And I believe that more NGOs, civil societies can work together in the Asia Pacific region to address this biodiversity challenge together with the climate crisis together.
Okay, and like very specifically on the private sector, I wonder. I mean, we've touched on it, and I want to expand a little bit more on it with some of the other speakers in just a second as well. But are we seeing that balance, that the right balance between the private and the public right now, between policy and business?
It's a great question. I think it's currently all the efforts are government driven. I mean, the government invested a huge amount of money, but the private sector, especially in Asia Pacific, we need to invest more, and especially we need to engage civil society to work together, and local community engaged and involved in these processes, not only for biodiversity conservation, but also to address the current climate crisis. In Asia, we understand that usually it's government. Well, I should not say the government domesticated, but I should say the government is a leading entity to address these challenges, but private sectors and the civil society need to be engaged more in Asia Pacific region, I should say.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Li Jiang, for your intervention there. Right. Look, we've been through the speakers now. We've heard from everyone. We've got some interventions coming later. But before we get to those, I do want to throw a few questions out there to all of our panelists. And by the way, at this stage, I also want to mention to our audience to keep sending some questions through. We've had some good ones through, which I'll put to the panel in just a second. But please do keep those coming. Before, I've got a question, the same question for all of you, and I'll come to that in a second. But before I do that, there are a couple of random ones I want to throw out there. And the first is to Indonesia. Miss Lakshmi Dedwanthi from Indonesia. If you can hear me and you're still with us, we spoke to Kave Zahedi about how supported the region feels by the international community. Is it enough? How important, how critical is it to you? I'd be interested to hear your view from Indonesia on this question.
Thank you, Axel, for the questions. You're asking about the regional support, and collaborations, maybe. Hello, can you hear me?
But also, yes, I can, but also support from the international community, from developed nations.
Well, it is indeed because there is no such one country could do this effort alone. We need to have a support from regional as well as from international. For example, that I share, or I have mentioned Indonesia effort toward the post-pandemic COVID-19 pandemics. So all the effort that Indonesia has been doing so far will have no good or best result if there is no support from international as well as from regional. So in terms of cooperative or technology transfer and development, in terms of financial support, as well as the commitment. For example, there is for Indonesia, we have numbers of if we're talking about environmental pollutions, there is the transboundary environmental pollutions and degradation. So we cannot just deal with our own challenge within the country, but we also need others to also prevent or do some measures to ensure that there is no transboundary movement of waste, for example, or for haze. So yes, for a country like Indonesia, well, especially as an archipelago countries, we need a greater support and collaborations from regional and from international community.
I've got a follow-up question for you from one of the audience. You mentioned national recovery programs. To what extent is it important to align these national programs between nations in the Asia Pacific region for greater impact?
The recovery programs?
Yes, the recovery programs. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we did mention about the ecosystem recovery programs. Mainly, our focus in two unique ecosystems, which are mangrove and peatland. For example, if I took the mangrove as an example, mangrove itself for Indonesia and I think it's not only for Indonesia. We know mangrove as the unique ecosystems at the coastals, and mangroves serve and provide numerous ecological functions, not only as the barriers or to prevent the terrestrial from the aberrations and from other disasters like tsunami, but having mangrove healthy, we will also have the healthy fisheries sectors, because
Yes.
mangrove, it's indeed a place, a very good place for breeding of various species. So if Indonesia, with a very large mangrove area, will uh, uh, be a more healthiest mangrove, then meaning that Indonesia will provide such a breeding site for various species of fisheries, and will support more healthiest fisheries production from the regionals at least, and from the global as well. Thank you.
Okay, Lakshmi, thank you very much indeed. Look, I want to pose the same international community support question to the minister from Palau as well, if I could. Minister Victor, I wonder, can you hear me okay? Same question to you. How you talked about going to COP26, about your presence there. Clearly, you're going to be talking to other governments there. How supported do you feel right now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so thanks for the question. We have benefited quite a bit from international support, and there's always more that for a small island like isolated from the rest of the world could benefit from international support. For example, we have closed 80% of our exclusive economic zone from fishing as a mitigation for climate change. But we know that as a small island country with large ocean, he said we rely on international and regional support in order for us to be effective in enforcing our closures. And so that's one support that Palau continues to need regional and international support. Going into COP26, as many Pacific Island countries face, we need technical support from global partners to be able for us to have meaningful dialogue across governments and across private sector who will be participating in Glasgow. So we look for those international support that help amplify the voices of the Pacific people in this international forum.
Thank you. Thank you. Kaveh Sahedi, let me just put you heard what the speaker from Indonesia on international support, what the minister from Palau has said. Do you think we will see, Kaveh, the sort of support that is required coming, or at least talked enough about it at the COP26 meeting in Glasgow? Kaveh Sahedi, this question.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you listen to the almost the preconditions for success that the UN Secretary General has talked about, closing the financing gap is always amongst the four issues that he's put on the table. At the moment, we fall short by OECD estimates. We fall about 20 billion short of the 100 billion estimate, or the 100 billion commitment, if you will. On climate change alone. But of course, Axel, this has to go beyond climate change, right? This is not just climate finance. It's about getting the climate finance, certainly getting the 100 billion. It's almost symbolic to some degree. It's about making sure enough of it flows into building resilience, into ensuring that we're leaving no one behind, including getting enough to adaptation. And right now, we fall well short on that. But we have to go, I think, beyond this. We have to go beyond the 100 billion. We have to go beyond climate finance. And frankly, there isn't one solution, right? We do need to tap into the capital markets. You know, these new bond markets have expanded by about tenfold over the past 5 years. We need to continue on that journey. We need to, as somebody said earlier, tap into the potential of private-public partnership. But not as almost procurement mechanisms that they are now, but really as instruments for sustainable change. We need to look at a green procurement of governments. Governments here spend a vast amount of GDP on procurement. Reorienting it would also begin to shift the markets in the right way. And actually, I just don't think everything will come from one source, and certainly everything will not come from international source. We have to combine the international source, especially for countries that don't have the ability to generate the domestic resources, especially for ones, for example, who've been so hard hit by the pandemic because the tourism industries have evaporated overnight, for example. But we have to combine that with the domestic measures needed as well. And we think there is enough fiscal space to make the right investments in sustainability. As long as we start to phase out the wrong kind of subsidies, especially to fossil fuels, we start the right kind of taxation, including taxing carbon, and all of that will open up the space for countries to be able to invest in the right way.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Kaveh. I want to pose, as I said before, a similar question to each of our panelists, and if I could start with Dechen and Sir Bob, who we heard from right at the beginning. I'd like to hear, Dechen, first from you. What are the 2 or 3 most ambitious actions that, from your point of view, will help pave the way as we move forward here? Dechen, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, so Bob, are you there?
Yep.
Yep. Did you hear my question?
Yes. Yep.
Go ahead.
Should I answer? Yep. In my opinion,
please do.
If we need to drastically transform the economic system, it's totally bankrupt. We have to replace GDP, or at least complement GDP, with measures of inclusive wealth, as I said in my talk, which is a much better measure of sustainable economic development. It allows us to actually value nature, not just in an economic sense, market and non-market, but also a social and biophysical sense. We need to absolutely get rid of these perverse subsidies, the direct subsidies, especially in agriculture and energy, and use that money we can save towards more sustainable practices. And then we need to address the indirect subsidies that is to say, the hidden subsidies, of which IMF estimate in energy of $5 trillion a year by internalizing externalities. So if I were to argue for one thing, and that is we need to go beyond targets and goals at both COP15 and COP26. We need actions, and we need to set some common agreement on getting rid of these perverse subsidies and investing that money in much more sustainable approaches, whether it's a carbon tax or some other approach. But we need to recognize we need to transform the economic system right across the world, basically. And that also means that's a major role for governments, but it's also a major role for the private sector and for the finance community. The finance community, banks, international and national, pension funds, insurance funds can all play a really key role to stop funding unsustainable practices and start to fund sustainable. And as I said in my talk, we need to address the energy, agriculture, and water sectors collectively.
You brought up carbon pricing, so I am going to quickly come back with a question on that. What, do you feel this is a system that can carbon pricing? So we talk 40, 50 right now, where in actual, when you look at what's really required, we need probably double that as a price if we're going to make headway. What your overarching thought on carbon pricing as we go ahead?
It makes eminent sense, but to be quite candid, I don't think it's politically feasible. I don't even think the European Union can get an agreement on what is a fair and equitable carbon price. Every time you talk about a carbon price in the US, the tax. Of course, the key issue is what do you do with those revenues? You can actually use those revenues for a lot of very useful issues. So while I actually believe a carbon tax would indeed be a good instrument, I think from a political sense, to get an agreement across the world on a carbon tax in a way that is also fair to poor people, so there are some social protection mechanisms in place for the higher cost of energy, it's a real challenge. But we do need to either make carbon markets work or to put a carbon tax. The key point is we are not putting the true costs on fossil fuels, which cause local, regional pollution and climate change. Fossil fuels are underpriced. We must get the price right. We must eliminate fossil fuels in all of our sectors within the next 10, maximum, maybe 12 years.
All right. Okay. Very much indeed, Sir Bob. Lakshmi, section to you. What are the 2 or 3 most ambitious things that you would like to see governments do and business do to move this process forward?
Okay. Yeah. I believe, of course, we need to have a stronger commitment, and we need to have a common basis and data to move forward. So achieving we need to be able to measure the target. Otherwise, we cannot achieve the target itself. So I think it is important to conceptualize as well as to have a concrete, measurable target of our commitments. So I think that's the important things. And the other things is it's communication and sharing information through various platforms. So indeed, sharing informations among stakeholders, it is important to stronger our effort and commitment toward these matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lakshmi. Minister Stephen Victor, same question to you.
And so I think one or two question is really shifting the thinking from nationalism to globalism in terms of bringing and taking action to reach 1.5 degrees that will address human survival and biodiversity for the planet. To me, that is one thing that if governments and business sector can shift their thinking from uh, personal gain, national economy to really looking at the world in peril and start taking those actions that is needed to take us into within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Thank you.
I think everyone has to, sort of acknowledge that climate change is real and that for the Hindu Kush Himalaya, for the mountains, the temperature increases are even sharper. So even a 1.5 degree centigrade world is too hot for this region. So we need the global community to recognize this as a unique region and one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change. So, drawing on from that, I think we need to strengthen regional cooperation. All governments, the regional governments must come together because most of the challenges are transboundary in nature. Look at air pollution. I think the Honorable Minister from Indonesia also mentioned it. The pollution is transboundary in nature. It arises from somewhere, lands up somewhere, and I think to address air pollution, we need regional cooperation, and we can do that. And then I think better planning. We in the mountains we really need to be careful about how we carry out infrastructure development, constructing roads, constructing tunnels, and so on, because that is actually triggering a lot of the disasters that we are experiencing, like landslides and floods and so on. So proper planning and proper implementation, which of course then comes to the final requirement, that is investment and expertise. And I hope the global community would recognize that in the mountains, the cost of building infrastructure, proper infrastructure, for example, proper road, is much higher than it is in the other areas, in flat areas or other regions. So investment from the region as well as from the global community, we have come up with an investment framework called Mountains of Opportunity. So I think while the pandemic as well as climate change has a lot of negative impacts, the impacts also offer a lot of opportunities for us to rebound better. Thank you, Alex. I'll stop here at this stage.
And we are back, and you're back with me. This is Shireen Zorba. I head the Global Secretariat of the Science Policy Business Forum. We will shortly be joined back with Axel Threlfall, but for now, I would like us to be able to carry on from where we left off, and I thank you all for your patience. So I'm going to go with a round of questions. We are asking the same question to all of our participants, who I would love to have on the screen if possible, and I will start with Kaveh. And Kaveh, I want you to tell us in 3 short sentences what you believe are the key actions that could pave the way to a better future.
Big, very big question, Shireen. Very big question indeed. Look, with COP around the corner and all the conversation we've just heard, I think the first one is it's all about alignment, really, and we've heard that from all the speakers. So I would say the first thing is we've got to align the climate ambitions with reality. So we have to get countries to still come to COP with ambitious NDCs, and we're not yet seeing that. We're seeing NDCs that fall well short. I mean, by our calculations, just the ones from Asia Pacific would lead to an increase of emissions of around 30% by 2030, rather than to start to bend the curve and the trajectory downwards. So alignment of climate ambitions with what we're seeing presented in the NDCs is really vital. I think a second one, which has been the basis of much of my intervention today, is alignment of national budgets with countries' aspirations. Countries aspire to sustainability, and yet, as Bob Watson said, they still measure progress by GDP. And we've seen in this region, GDP grows, but along with it grows inequality, vulnerability, environmental degradation. And we just need to see an realignment of national budgets with the aspirations of achieving the SDGs, with the aspirations of achieving the climate goals that we have. And I think we need an alignment of business. It's as if we're living in two worlds. One is people, and the other is the economy and what businesses are doing. You've seen the complete absurd divergence between booming stock markets and people suffering because of COVID. That's just one indicator that we have a bizarre duality, and we need a realignment of private sector and businesses that deliver not just for shareholders, but really for the stakeholders. And there's many ways of orienting that, especially through government policy. So those would be three of my on my wish list, Shireen.
That's very good. Now, let me move to Brenda, and maybe from a technology perspective, from a people's perspective, and maybe also I will ask you to have a look at gender equality when we talk about the digital divide. Over to you, Brenda.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it falls right in line with what we just heard. So, let me say, from a private enterprise view, I'm proud to say that IBM does pursue the highest standards of corporate social responsibility and values in all we do, and our commitment to net zero greenhouse gas by 2030. We need to work with all of our peers across the industries, and not just in technology, but in finance and distribution and manufacturing, to help them establish their ESG goals. So we have created a sustainability climate practice, and we can share best practices and leverage investments. The second, which talks about core at the people, which we just heard, digital divide, diversity and inclusion. We have invested significantly in building technical skills and talent, our pathways to technology across many of the countries in Asia, many of my peers here on the panel, in China, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. All of this about creating opportunities for all high school students to get a degree in technology that can help them be part of this community to solve these world problems. So an investment there. We also are investing in STEM in India, 50,000 girls to have at really even earlier stages an opportunity to go into science and technology. And then the third, I would say, is that as IBM, we spend a lot on IBM research. We're very proud of this. And we need to work with governments and other industries, like we're giving quantum to many of the universities. We need to look at how we look at materials, we look at science, we look at medicine, and just things like, where's the best place to store carbon in trees or in rocks? And really leverage the research that's not just all commercialized, that it is to help for the greater good. So I think, too, it serves all population, especially in the developing countries, with weather, with farming, and water, and all of the essentials that everyone should have in life.
Thank you very much, Brenda. And food for thought. And I want to tell you, the number of questions we are receiving is a lot, and very good questions from all over the region, indeed from all over the world. So what we will do, we will try to cover as much as possible, and we did lose some time, but I think we will get back to you, and we will need to carry those on video if you allow us to do so, because some of them are really, really, really good. Now, before I go to Sir Bob, I will go first to Li Jiang, and maybe from your perspective, and especially when we talk about the private sector and the link between the private sector and the targets for biodiversity, which, let us be honest, they have not been achieved. Do you think we are leaving the private sector behind when it comes to the biodiversity targets? Are they involved enough? What are the actions that are ambitious that can pave the way to better engagement?
Thank you, Sharon. It's a great question. As we know that the business sector, the private sector, is always recognized as a user or consumer of the biodiversity or other nature resources. Certainly they are, but we also recognize that they are an important part and should be engaged in the biodiversity conservation. And as we know that, as I said before, the government are always a leading entity, but we do need to engage business sector as well as civil society involved in the the post 2020 biodiversity conservation, as well as implementing the Paris Agreement. I don't think private sector is far behind this processes, but I think we need to support and engage more involvement of private sectors in these processes. As I said before, the combination measures are needed to mitigate the climate change as well as reduce pollution, control the loss of biodiversity, as well as actions to transform economic and financial system to ensure sustainable products and consumption. And private sector wants is an important part in this processes, as important as the government system as well as the civil society system. So we do need to engage all involved. So it's a we should not leave them alone.
Very much indeed. Now, I'm going to take one intervention from civil society in a second, but before that, I will go to Dr. Pama. And Dr. Pama, the same question, but we are talking now mountain regions, remote communities, most vulnerable communities. And also, you've done a lot of work on gender, and especially in these regions. If there is one action or two actions that you believe can be transformational, what would those be?
Thank you very much. First of all, when you talk about leaving no one behind, I think we should not leave the mountains behind, because mountains we can see very far. And if you leave them behind, you will see the consequences, and they will not leave behind. This in the perspective of leaving no one behind. Now, ISIMOT, we are working with our scientific partners in gathering scientific evidence to encourage our member countries to even set higher targets, even set more ambitious targets. Already they have set very ambitious targets, but it is our responsibility to give them the kind of evidence that is needed to allow them to reach carbon neutrality even earlier than what they have projected. So that is one, and also to take measures to adapt to climate change impacts. But as I was mentioning earlier, both these actions would require higher levels of investment as well as also cooperation with technology firms such as IBM. I think we have heard from Brenda the use of AI, applications in many of our work. Now, just to give you an example of how we are working, on mitigation. One is we are working with the brick industries in both Nepal and Pakistan in terms of converting this, the technology that they use for firing bricks from the conventional one to what you call zigzag. And along with that, we are also looking at the role of women, role of children in that industry. And we have formed now Women Employees Group and got the entrepreneurs and the employees together to look at different dimensions to address the equity issues, the treasury issues, the child care issues, and so on. So this is just one example. Another thing that we noticed throughout the Hindu Kush Himalayas is the drying up of springs. When springs dry up, and then springs are where they have, where most of the drinking water comes from, the irrigation water comes from. And when springs dry up, women have to go, much longer distances to fetch water. And therefore, we are also engaging in a program to rehabilitate these springs. So these are just few examples of what we do on the ground, but we are working only with partners in our member countries, with women's groups, with CSOs, to identify the issues and then address them and linked to our programs, such as even in disaster management. And women are most vulnerable to natural disasters like floods, and we have put in place so-called community-based early flood warning systems, where we ensure that the women's safety issues are taken into consideration. So these are just few examples. Thank you very much. Back to
These
you,
were
Shirin.
excellent examples. Thank you so much. Now, Sir Bob, I will let you have the last word from the science perspective in a second. But before that, I would like us to be able to take an intervention from the floor. And this is from Tu Ann Guggen, the children and youth major groups. So I hope we can, hello, lovely to see you. And it's really wonderful to be able to have the voice of youth and major groups in this session from the region. So over to you.
Thank you very much for letting me have the floor. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, dear presence, I am Tu An Nguyen from Vietnam, and it's my pleasure to deliver an intervention on behalf of the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP. Asia-Pacific region has witnessed devastating impacts of the pandemic, yet this doesn't mean the climate can be ignored in the political agenda. And this opportunity to shift towards a circular economy is disheartening for us to see not much green response as plummet. Stimulus packages funneled on high polluting mainstays. Too little support has been geared towards green stimulus transition. As children and youth, we refuse to compromise. How can we be calm and optimistic when we start to lose trust? As panelists and excellencies have briefly mentioned, I want to stress on the word inclusive. By stressing inclusive, I refer to intergenerational dialogue, racially diverse discussion, acknowledgement of women, LGBTQ+, and people with special needs. I mean involving indigenous communities as an integral part of the decision-making process. I also refer to breaching digital access to information, especially for marginalized groups. By stressing inclusive, I also mean opportunities, funding for young people's scientific research, investment in green jobs landscape, encouragement of green entrepreneurship, which has been rippling among young people, especially female and indigenous entrepreneurs, networking spaces, education, training, incubation programs to foster ideas from creative young minds, and inclusivity of big forums, especially in the upcoming COP26, when the vaccine rollouts are unequal for developing countries. How can a sustainable recovery be ensured if efforts are placed elsewhere instead? I used to hate being a youth, if not a child. I hated that youth were referred to with inadequacy instead of actual potential, drive, and capabilities. But over the past few years, I've seen innovations of youth in grassroots projects, in research, and youth's key role in advocating for SDG goals. Now I'm proud of my identity, even more as a youth from a developing country. But climate policymakers must do better to recognize youth as important agents of change with values and visions. Children and youth are not only willing to contribute to dialogues, but are ready to engage from the beginning of ideation and political processes. Global problems need global solutions, and we need to work together. Science, technology, business, and policy, the enthusiasm of young people, and the wisdom of professionals, public, private sectors, academia, and civil societies. Only when governments, corporations, individuals begin to regard nature's resources as their capital will a green transition be realized. And we invite you to take action and act fast. What can be done to gather more practical outcomes from intersectional dialogues, forums, and conferences such as today? How can policy options provide an incentive for behavioral change? How to use this decade of action to create and deploy innovation and advanced technology in order to transform sustainable consumption and production, especially in pandemic recovery, and how to ensure, after all, inclusivity. Climate change is real, and we hope that you can see young people, not only just any participants, but at the forefront of the solution for a brighter, cleaner future after the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. You leave us with very important questions. And I think as we work together, we will try to seek some of the answers from you as well. Now, I want to move to Wally Haider, and he represents the major groups and stakeholders. He has he has an intervention for our panel, and he's from the Farmers Major Group. So I hope Wally Haider is with us. Go ahead, please. Wally, can you
thank
hear
you
us?
very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity in this very important event. As in our major group and stakeholder forums during previous UNEA, we have been raising our voice that this Science Policy Business Forum need to be transformed into Science Policy People's Forum, where the local wisdom and common knowledge can be also recognized. In this era of new colonialism, science and policies that do not serve humanity do not solve the major challenges faced by the vast majority of the globe, particularly in the developing world, is not really science. It seems more instrumental science, hinderman to capitalist enterprises for the rich industrial countries who are in a sense the 1% of the world. From green revolution to gene revolution, from geoengineering to artificial intelligence to big data, science has served the giant corporations across all sectors, may those in the agrochemical industry, the pharma industry, or the defense industry. The market concentration of these giant corporations is well collaborated by the figure. Only a handful of seed corporations dominate more than 60 to 70% of the market in seed, agrochemical or industry. Let me remind you that the 70% of all carbon emissions are from only 100 corporations, of which the oil corporations dominates. The global dominance of these corporations in our countries, their ability to extract and monopolize as well as destroy the planet Earth, precious biodiversity, has been made possible by science lending itself very willingly to these acts of plunder and exploitation by being in service to very unfair, violent trade rules and legal system such as WTO's agreement, but particularly TRIPS, SPS, and TBT. Science has provided corporation legitimacy to plunder and control over resources and hamper our national and people's sovereignty. We know that the two-thirds of the world food is produced by small farmers. Yet science has served for the interests of the big agri giant and the big data, and not those who have served humanity selflessly, while serving from constant hunger and poverty, all because of so-called evidence-based science thrust on them. Even during the tragic time of pandemic, the pharma industry has not given up its greed for profit and allowed vaccine to be free of patents and make them part of the public service. It is truly a breaking down of humanity, particularly in context to the silence of the scientific community. We believe that transformative shifts needed for dealing with the core inequalities that have led to the climate crisis, loss of biodiversity, and decent livelihood for workers and peasants, women, fisherfolk, indigenous people, among others, is only possible way when science is people-led and not corporate-led. We urgently need science that serves to the principle of the science is service of the people, serving to eliminate human suffering, hunger, and disease. I need not to stress this, that of course, people's science is based on local and indigenous knowledge and wisdom, serving to attain the just, genuine, sustainable development. I thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Well, Haider, thank you very much for this intervention, and thank you for bringing the voice of farmers to the Science Policy Business Forum. Now, for last words, I'll go to Sir Bob Watson. And Sir Bob Watson, your work, Making Peace with Nature, has framed UNEP's work in the past few months and hopefully in towards the next UNEA and beyond. So you've listened to the different interventions. You've heard various perspectives. You gave us already some excellent perspectives and insights into how the future can look like. But I'll bring it back to you maybe with, if there is the one thing that governments, that the business sector, and that society needs to think about moving forward, the one thing that you feel can be transformational and that can help us at scale does this one thing exist? Or is it a combination of actions by different actors that you would say, let's go in that direction? This is the only way to be able to respond to the immense crises that the world is facing.
There is no single silver bullet, unfortunately. If we want a better and more equitable world, we need to achieve all of the Sustainable Development Goals, which, if implemented and achieved, would leave nobody behind. But we cannot achieve the SDGs unless we meet the Paris targets, unless we meet the 2050 vision for biodiversity, which means we need to put in place policies, technologies, financing, behaviour change for all stakeholders. It needs to be monitorable and measurable. We have to recognise diverse worldviews. We have to recognise diverse values. And the last two interventions of the youth and the farmers must be listened to. This is not an issue of just governments, as I've already said. We need all stakeholders to play their part. We need a polycentric governance structure at the national level, subnational and global level, where all voices are heard and the vested interests who want to maintain the status quo must be eliminated. So there is no single issue. If you had to ask me, it would be two things: reform of the economic and financing system, and making sure we look at all the sectors together, because they all interact with each other, but we're all in this together.
Sir Bob Watson, thank you very much. And with these words, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the conclusion of the first part of the high-level opening of the Asia-Pacific Science Policy Business Forum. Stay with us. We will take a 10-minute break, and then we will be back with Axel Threlfall, with our high-level panel, who will look at technology, innovation, and people. Stay with us.